January 7, 1942 marked a moment of profound miscalculation. Deep within his East Prussian headquarters, Adolf Hitler rendered judgment on the United States that would ultimately determine his regime's destruction. America appeared to him as a nation in terminal decline. Social divisions ran deep, he observed. Racial tensions fractured their society. Jewish influence corrupted their institutions, while African American presence diluted their strength. Such a fractured state could never endure serious conflict, he concluded. Meanwhile, 7,000 miles westward in Richmond, California, an entirely different vision took shape. Henry Kaiser, 57 years old and lacking any shipbuilding background, sketched designs on hotel stationery. His resume listed dams, highways, and bridges. Ships represented uncharted territory. The established maritime industry insisted 8 months represented minimum construction time for cargo vessels. Kaiser examined his rough drawings and informed his assembled team they would complete construction in 4 days. Hitler's assessment rested on perceived American weakness. Kaiser would systematically demolish that assumption. German intelligence had spent years analyzing American potential before hostilities began. Their reports painted a consistent picture. The United States functioned as a commercial republic, not a military power. Consumer mentality dominated their culture. Their standing army in 1939 ranked smaller than Portugal's forces. Manufacturing focused on automobiles and household appliances rather than weapon systems. Decades of prosperity had made citizens comfortable and unwilling to accept wartime hardships. When President Roosevelt announced intentions to produce 50,000 aircraft annually in May 1940, German military leadership dismissed the claim as absurd propaganda. American military aviation output in 1939 had barely exceeded 3,000 total aircraft. A 20-fold increase seemed impossible. Hermann Göring, who commanded the Luftwaffe and stood among Hitler's inner circle, shared this contempt. He had constructed Germany's air force into Europe's most formidable aviation power from essentially nothing. He understood the intricate requirements of modern combat aircraft production. Precision engineering capabilities, specialized metallurgy, trained workforce. Years of accumulated manufacturing expertise. America possessed none of these advantages. The notion that automobile factories could transform into aircraft plants struck him as laughable fantasy. German generals carried memories of the First World War. American troops had arrived in France during the conflict's final year, performing adequately but entering late with relatively minimal casualties compared to European powers. They contributed little strategic direction. Those green doughboys reinforced beliefs that Americans lacked the hardness sustained combat demanded. Albert Speer, later Hitler's armaments minister, attended many dinner conversations where his leader discussed America. Hitler maintained Americans had played minimal roles in the 1914 to 1918 war, making few blood sacrifices. They would certainly crumble under sustained pressure, he insisted, because their fighting qualities remained inferior. No unified American people existed, Hitler argued. Only masses of immigrants from disparate nations and races. This racial analysis formed Hitler's worldview foundation. He believed national strength flowed directly from racial purity and homogeneity. Germany, with its supposed Aryan bloodlines, possessed inherent superiority that would manifest in battle. America, a mongrel nation of immigrants, Jews, and African Americans, could never match German martial spirit. The German analysis contained fatal flaws. They measured American potential solely through peacetime performance. They observed an unmobilized nation and concluded mobilization was impossible. They saw consumer goods factories and assumed weapons production was beyond reach. They witnessed population diversity and interpreted it as weakness. Every conclusion proved catastrophically wrong. Transformation commenced before America formally entered the conflict. Summer 1940 brought France's fall and Britain's siege. Roosevelt challenged American industry to achieve what he termed a miracle of production. Automobile factories would cease car manufacturing. Appliance plants would abandon refrigerator production. Every lathe press and assembly line across America would convert to military output. This represented far more than rallying rhetoric. It constituted fundamental economic restructuring. In 1941, American assembly lines produced over 3 million automobiles. The subsequent 4 years would see only 139 more vehicles manufactured. The automotive industry's entire capacity redirected toward weapons. Chrysler manufactured aircraft fuselages. General Motors produced airplane engines, weapons, trucks, and armored vehicles. Packard built Rolls-Royce engines for British forces. Companies whose most dangerous products had been kitchen appliances learned ammunition production. Conversion happened with remarkable speed because American industry possessed capabilities German analysts never grasped. The key was standardization with interchangeable components. American factories had pioneered mass production techniques, allowing different facilities to manufacture parts fitting together perfectly. An Ohio carburetor would fit a Michigan engine powering a California-assembled vehicle. This interchangeable part system, developed over decades for civilian markets, now applied to war materials. Skeptics insisted it couldn't work. Aircraft weren't automobiles. You couldn't stamp out bombers like Model T Fords. Tolerances were too precise. Systems were too complex. A single heavy bomber contained over 1 million components. An automobile had 15,000. Henry Kaiser ignored skeptics entirely. December 1940 brought a government contract for 30 British cargo ships. He possessed no shipyard, no maritime construction experience, no trained workers. What he possessed was methodology. The system was everything. Kaiser didn't approach shipbuilding through traditional maritime thinking. He viewed it as manufacturing challenge. The specific product, whether ships, dams, or highways, mattered less than process optimization. Every manufacturing process could be analyzed, decomposed, optimized, and scaled. Traditional shipbuilders accumulated knowledge through apprenticeship. Skilled riveters spent years mastering their trade. Kaiser lacked years. He had months. So he designed processes learnable in days, substituting capital for labor wherever possible, investing in machinery to replace hand labor. Established shipbuilders declared this approach doomed. Ships were too complex. Oceans were too unforgiving. Amateur-built vessels would sink. Kaiser proved them entirely wrong. His ships were not merely constructed faster than traditional vessels. They were built better. Defect rates at Kaiser's yards ran less than half those at conventional shipyards. The systematic approach that accelerated production simultaneously improved quality. Kaiser applied principles that had delivered Hoover Dam ahead of schedule. He broke shipbuilding into modules. Rather than constructing vessels from keel upward on single slipways, he prefabricated entire sections at different locations, assembling them like building blocks. Welding replaced riveting, faster and requiring less skilled labor. He recruited workers nationwide, built housing, established childcare centers, created healthcare systems maintaining healthy, productive workforces. Ordinary Americans transformed into shipbuilders at speeds defying conventional wisdom. Men and women who had never seen oceans, never held welding torches, never entered industrial facilities, learned ship construction in weeks. Kaiser's training programs were ruthlessly efficient. New workers became competent welders in 10 days. Within 30 days, they functioned as productive team members. Workers came from everywhere. Oklahoma farmers who had lost land to drought. Detroit factory workers laid off during Depression years. Women who had never worked outside homes. African Americans seeking opportunities denied them in the segregated South. The Richmond Yards workforce eventually peaked above 90,000 people, nearly one-third women. These women became wartime mobilization symbols. They drilled rivets, welded seams, installed wiring. Work exclusively male before the war. Government promoted their contributions through posters and films featuring strong, determined women in factory settings. These images became iconic home-run representations. Thousands worked across America in shipyards and aircraft plants, proving workforce expansion in ways German planners never anticipated. Established shipbuilders watched in disbelief. They had built ships identically for decades. They knew what was possible. Kaiser's methods violated every craft principle. Ships should be riveted, not welded. Construction should occur on slipways, not scattered fabrication shops. Workers needed years of training, not weeks. But Kaiser's methods worked magnificently. In 1941, average Liberty ship construction time, the war's standard cargo vessel, was 230 days. By 1942, Kaiser's yards reduced this to 45 days, then 30, then 20. November 1942 saw Kaiser's Richmond shipyard construct the Liberty ship Robert E. Peary in 4 days and 15 hours. From keel laying to launching took less time than German U-boats needed crossing the Atlantic. Germans now faced unanticipated strategic crisis. Admiral Karl Donitz, commanding Germany's submarine fleet, had staked everything on simple calculation. His submarines would sink Allied shipping faster than replacement was possible. Early 1942 saw this strategy apparently succeeding. German U-boats prowled American East Coast waters during what they called the Second Happy Time, sinking hundreds of merchant ships within shore sight. Oil tankers burned off Florida's coast. Cargo vessels sank within view of New Jersey beaches. Reinhard Hardegen, commanding U-123, numbered among the first captains hunting American waters. January 1942 found him torpedoing ships, so close to shore he could see city lights reflected off smoke. Americans had implemented neither blackout procedures nor convoy organization. They seemed almost to invite attack. Hardegen sank 8 ships on his first patrol, returning to Germany as a hero. Other U-boat commanders followed. Through 1942's first 6 months, German submarines sank nearly 400 ships in American coastal waters. Losses were catastrophic. Oil that should have fueled Allied armor pooled on Atlantic beaches. Food intended for British civilians rotted at sea bottom. Essential strategic materials vanished beneath waves. Donitz believed victory was within grasp. His submarines inflicted damage, exceeding his most optimistic projections. If losses continued at this rate, Britain would be strangled. American war efforts would collapse before full mobilization. But even as U-boats accumulated kills, shipyards were accelerating. 1942 saw American shipyards launch 8 million tons of new shipping. 1943 brought 19 million tons. By fall 1943, new construction exceeded losses for the first time. Every sunken ship was replaced by 2 more. Donitz watched numbers with mounting alarm. His submarines were sinking ships at rates that would have won the First World War. But this wasn't the First World War. This was conflict against an enemy whose industrial capacity defied comprehension. The mathematics were merciless. Donitz calculated his U-boats needed to sink 700,000 tons monthly to strangle Britain. In 1942, they came close. But by 1943, American shipyards alone were launching over 1 million tons monthly. The target kept moving, always receding, always beyond reach. Worse yet, Americans were learning rapidly. Early East Coast disasters had exposed anti-submarine warfare failures. Convoys were organized. Aircraft deployed to patrol shipping lanes. New technologies, like radar and improved sonar, gave defenders previously lacking advantages. May 1943 forced Donitz to withdraw his U-boats from the Atlantic. In a single month, 43 submarines had been lost. The tonnage they sank no longer justified casualties they suffered. The Battle of the Atlantic, which Germany needed to win to strangle Britain, was lost. U-boat crews surviving the May disaster returned to occupied France in shock. They had gone to sea believing in victory. They came back understanding they had lost. The endless convoys they had hunted now sailed with impenetrable escorts. Allied aircraft that had once been rare now seemed omnipresent. The technological superiority German submarines had enjoyed was gone. What happened at sea was replicated in the air. Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant outside Detroit became American industrial might symbol. Designed by famed industrial architect Albert Kahn, the facility covered 3.5 million square feet, making it the world's largest factory under one roof. Its purpose: mass-produce the B-24 Liberator, a four-engine heavy bomber more complex than anything Ford had ever manufactured. The challenges were immense. The B-24 contained over 1 million parts and more than 300,000 rivets in 550 different sizes. It required precision engineering the automobile industry had never attempted. Ford's production chief, Charles Sorensen, studied aircraft manufacturer Consolidated's methods and found them primitive. Bombers were being assembled outdoors by hand using techniques unchanged for decades. Sorensen proposed something revolutionary: build bombers on moving assembly lines, just like automobiles. Critics called the idea insane. Dutch Kindleberger, president of North American Aviation, scoffed that you couldn't expect blacksmiths to make watches overnight. The skepticism wasn't unreasonable. Aircraft manufacturing fundamentally differed from automobile production. Cars could have minor variations and function perfectly. Aircraft with minor variations might fall from the sky. Tolerances were measured in thousandths of inches. Materials were exotic alloys behaving differently than automotive steel. Systems, hydraulic, electrical, pneumatic, had to work in perfect harmony at 25,000 feet in sub-zero temperatures. Ford struggled initially. The government kept changing aircraft design, disrupting assembly lines. Workers had to learn entirely new skills. The press mocked the facility as Will It Run instead of Willow Run. Senator Harry Truman investigated delays and publicly questioned whether Ford could deliver on promises. The problems were real. Consolidated Aircraft, which had designed the B-24, kept making modifications based on combat experience. Every change required Ford to retool assembly lines. Dies costing thousands of dollars became obsolete overnight. Workers who had mastered one process needed retraining for another. Ford's response was characteristically stubborn. The company assigned 200 engineers to work around the clock converting Consolidated's hand-drawn sketches into precise manufacturing specifications. They produced 5 miles of technical drawings daily. When Consolidated modifications made drawings obsolete before implementation, Ford engineers started over without complaint. The company also decentralized production substantially. Rather than building entire aircraft at Willow Run, Ford created subcontractor networks manufacturing components, then shipped to the main plant for final assembly. Engines came from Buick in Flint. Propellers came from Hamilton Standard in Connecticut. Landing gear came from Goodyear in Ohio. The logistics alone would have been impossible for any organization that hadn't spent decades mastering supply chain management. By 1944, problems were solved. Willow Run produced one B-24 every 63 minutes. At peak production in April 1944, the plant turned out 453 bombers in a single month. Between April 24th and April 26th that year, 100 completed bombers flew away from Willow Run in just 72 hours. Workers operated 2 9-hour shifts, 6 days weekly. The remaining 6 hours daily were used to restock parts, perform maintenance, and change tooling. Even with this relentless schedule, the workforce was reduced from 42,000 to 17,000 as efficiency improved. The same bomber numbers required fewer and fewer workers to produce. The Army Air Forces eventually had to tell Ford to slow down. They had no place to park all the aircraft. Storage areas at training bases overflowed with B-24s awaiting crews. Production capacity exceeded the military's ability to deploy aircraft. Meanwhile, American aircraft production overall reached numbers the German High Command had declared impossible. In 1944 alone, the United States built more than 96,000 military aircraft. That single year's production exceeded Japan's total aircraft output for the entire war. American factories produced nearly 300,000 aircraft between 1940 and 1945, accounting for roughly 2/3 of all Allied military equipment. The scale defied comprehension. At peak production, American industry was building more aircraft in a single month than Germany had possessed at war start. Assembly lines ran 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly. Shifts changed at midnight, noon, and midnight again. The factories never stopped. Consider what these numbers meant practically. 300,000 aircraft would stretch wingtip to wingtip for more than 30,000 miles, enough to circle Earth at the equator. The fuel to fly these aircraft required an entire petroleum infrastructure, tankers, pipelines, and refineries dedicated to aviation gasoline. The crews to man them required a training establishment processing hundreds of thousands of young men through programs turning civilians into combat aviators in less than 1 year. The scale of American mobilization went beyond what simple statistics could capture. Behind every aircraft, every ship, every tank was a supply chain stretching back to mines, forests, and farms across the continent. Aluminum came from bauxite or shipped from South America. Rubber came from plantations in Liberia and Brazil after Japanese conquests cut off Asian supplies. Cotton for uniforms came from southern farms. Food came from the agricultural heartland. The entire economy reoriented toward war production. Women who had never worked outside homes learned to operate machinery their mothers had never seen. African Americans migrated north to take factory jobs previously closed to them. Rural Americans moved to industrial cities where housing shortages forced families to live in shifts, with day workers sleeping in beds vacated by night workers. The social transformation was as dramatic as the industrial one. Germans faced the consequences of their misjudgment in European skies. Their pilots were among the world's best trained. Their aircraft, particularly fighters like the Messerschmitt 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, were formidable machines. In individual engagements, German pilots often outperformed American counterparts. Early American bomber crews were painfully inexperienced. Many pilots had fewer than 300 total flight hours when beginning combat missions. Navigation errors sent formations miles off course. Bombing accuracy was poor. Coordination with fighter escorts was imperfect. German pilots exploited these weaknesses ruthlessly. The Luftwaffe developed tactics specifically designed to break up bomber formations and isolate stragglers. Head-on attacks at closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour gave gunners only seconds to react. German fighters equipped with rockets could fire from beyond defensive machine gun range. But attrition was relentless. For every German aircraft shot down, Americans could produce 3 more. For every experienced German pilot killed, Americans could train 5 replacements. The Luftwaffe bled out slowly, not from a single decisive defeat, but from the cumulative weight of an enemy who could absorb losses and keep coming. American training programs were industrial operations in their own right. Flight schools processed thousands of cadets simultaneously. Instructors flew multiple training sorties daily. Aircraft were available in abundance because the same factories building combat planes also built trainers. The entire system was designed for throughput, for turning raw material into finished product as efficiently as possible. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was sustaining losses of 25% of its aircrew and 40% of its aircraft every month. These were losses no air force could survive indefinitely. The Thousand-Year Reich didn't have 1,000 years of pilots to sacrifice. German pilots, who had begun the war with years of training and hundreds of flight hours, were replaced by men who had weeks of instruction and dozens of hours in the cockpit. The average experience level of Luftwaffe fighter pilots dropped steadily throughout 1944. By war's end, some German pilots were flying their first combat mission with less than 100 total flight hours. Americans, meanwhile, continued improving. Early bomber crews had been painfully inexperienced, but survivors of 1,943 raids became instructors who trained 1944 crews. Tactics evolved. Equipment improved. The P-51 Mustang, with its long range and exceptional performance, finally gave bomber formations the protection they needed. The German misjudgment extended beyond industry to American soldiers fighting quality. In February 1943, American ground forces met the German army in combat for the first time at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. The result appeared to confirm every German prejudice. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps tore through inexperienced American positions. Units broke and ran. Equipment was abandoned. Command and control collapsed. American casualties exceeded 6,000. Some German officers, who had dismissed Americans as soft now, had battlefield evidence supporting their contempt. The Americans at Kasserine were inexperienced in ways only combat could reveal. Many soldiers had never fired weapons in anger. Officers who had trained for years in peacetime conditions found themselves unable to function under fire. Radio communications failed. Coordination between infantry and armor broke down. Units that should have supported each other fought in isolation. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, General George Patton's son-in-law, was among those captured during the debacle. He had led an armored counterattack against German positions at Sidi Bouzid. The attack ran straight into German panzers and anti-tank guns positioned in classic ambush. American tanks burst into flames. Infantry scattered. Waters was wounded, captured, and spent the rest of the war in a German prison camp. Stories like his multiplied across the battlefield. American artillery was poorly positioned. American infantry dug foxholes in wrong places. American armor advanced without reconnaissance. The Germans, who had been fighting in the desert for 2 years, exploited every mistake with professional precision. Rommel himself initially scorned the inexperienced American troops. They seemed undisciplined and poorly led compared to British forces he had been fighting for 2 years. The Kasserine debacle reinforced German belief that American material superiority could be offset by German fighting quality. Reports from the battle filtered back to Berlin. German intelligence officers compiled assessments, confirming what Hitler had always believed. Americans were soft. Their equipment was abundant, but their soldiers were weak. German martial spirit would triumph over American industrial power. But Rommel was too skilled a general to let initial impressions harden into permanent assumptions. He watched what happened after Kasserine, and what he saw troubled him deeply. Americans recovered with startling speed. Within weeks of the disaster, they reorganized forces, relieved incompetent commanders, and implemented brutal lessons learned. General George Patton took command of the demoralized II Corps and transformed it through sheer force of will. Tactics improved. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery tightened. Air support became more effective. Patton was a force of nature. He descended on II Corps like a thunderstorm, demanding discipline, punishing sloppiness, and driving men to standards they had never met before. Soldiers who had slouched through the Kasserine disaster found themselves polishing brass, standing at attention, and training harder than they had ever trained in their lives. But Patton did more than impose discipline. He studied why Americans had failed and implemented specific corrections. Artillery forward observers were repositioned. Tank tactics were revised. Infantry learned to coordinate more closely with armor. The lessons of Kasserine were analyzed, documented, and disseminated. The American military possessed an institutional commitment to learning from failure that Germans failed to recognize. After Kasserine, the Army's Ground Forces commander, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, conducted a comprehensive review of what had gone wrong. His findings were sent back to training camps across the United States, where they shaped preparation of divisions that had not yet deployed. The mistakes of February 1943 became the curriculum of March 1943. Rommel later recorded his observations. The tactical conduct of the enemy's defense had been first class, he wrote. They had recovered very quickly after the first shock and had soon succeeded in damming up the advance. Unlike many German generals, Rommel didn't make the mistake of underestimating how fast Americans learned from their failures. Carlo D'Este, a historian who studied Rommel's papers, noted that the Desert Fox observed something important about American forces after Kasserine. Things had rapidly improved for them. Rommel wrote that although they had to wait until Patton's army in France to see the most astonishing achievement in mobile warfare, even after the initial disaster, Rommel recognized he was watching an opponent who would only get better. By May 1943, 3 months after Kasserine, the war in North Africa was over. 275,000 German and Italian soldiers marched into prisoner-of-war cages, more than had surrendered at Stalingrad. The Americans, who had panicked at Kasserine, were now among the victors. The speed of American recovery shocked German commanders, who had expected a longer period of demoralization. In their experience, units that had been routed required months to rebuild their effectiveness. Americans had rebuilt in weeks. The psychological resilience this demonstrated was perhaps more troubling than the material resources. German prisoners captured in Tunisia reported their surprise at American logistics. The American soldiers they fought seemed to have unlimited ammunition, unlimited fuel, unlimited food. When German units ran short of supplies, they had to improvise. When American units ran short, replacement supplies arrived within days. The lesson was clear to German intelligence officers analyzing the North African campaign. Material superiority could compensate for inexperience. Americans had been outfought at Kasserine, but they had never been outproduced. As long as American factories kept running, American armies would keep fighting. The question was whether Germany could win quickly enough to make the production differential irrelevant. After Tunisia, that question had an answer. They could not. The pattern repeated throughout the war. American forces stumbled initially, learned rapidly, and improved continuously. The same troops who had fled from German tanks in Tunisia would storm Normandy's beaches and fight their way across France. The same pilots who had been outmaneuvered by experienced Luftwaffe veterans would eventually sweep the German Air Force from the skies. This adaptive capacity was built into American institutions. The Army's ground forces command maintained a continuous feedback loop between combat units and training establishments. After-action reports from the front were analyzed within weeks and incorporated into revised training programs. Doctrine was updated based on battlefield experience. Equipment was modified to address problems identified by soldiers in combat. The system wasn't elegant. It was often chaotic. Different units developed different solutions to similar problems. Coordination between service branches was imperfect, but the chaos was productive. Ideas that worked survived and spread. Ideas that failed were abandoned. The organization as a whole became more effective even when individual components struggled. German military culture, by contrast, had calcified around fixed doctrines and personal loyalties. Initiative was discouraged. Failure was often fatal to careers. The same rigidity that had produced brilliant early victories became a liability when circumstances changed. The Wehrmacht could execute plans with devastating efficiency, but it struggled to adapt when those plans went wrong. Hitler made this rigidity worse. He interfered constantly in military operations, overruling his generals based on intuition rather than analysis. Commanders learned that disagreeing with the Führer was career-ending at best and potentially fatal. The honest assessments that might have corrected German strategy were suppressed in favor of reports that told Hitler what he wanted to hear. The contrast between American and German organizational cultures was starkest in the treatment of failure. When American commanders failed, they were replaced, but they were rarely punished. General Lloyd Fredendall, who had commanded the Kasserine Pass debacle, was relieved of command but sent back to the United States to train new troops. His experience, even failed experience, was considered valuable. When German commanders failed, they risked not just their careers, but their lives. After the July 1944 assassination attempt, Hitler's paranoia intensified. Generals suspected of disloyalty were executed. Even success was no guarantee of safety if it came at the cost of contradicting Hitler's orders. This created a culture of conformity at the worst possible time. German officers, who recognized the impossibility of their strategic situation, often said nothing because speaking honestly was too dangerous. The information reaching Hitler was filtered through layers of people who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. German generals who had dismissed American fighting quality at Kasserine never fully adjusted their assessments. They attributed American success to material abundance alone, refusing to acknowledge the organizational learning that made that abundance effective. They continued believing German martial spirit could overcome American industry even as American armies pushed them back across France, across the Rhine, and into Germany's heart itself. When D-Day came in June 1944, German commanders in France were surprised by the invasion force's scale. Over 156,000 Allied troops landed on the first day, supported by nearly 7,000 naval vessels and 11,000 aircraft. The logistics required to move this force across the English Channel and supply it on hostile shores represented an organizational achievement German planners had considered impossible. The American role in the invasion was overwhelming. The equipment supporting the assault, landing craft, transport aircraft, tanks and trucks moving inland from beaches came largely from American factories. Ships that bombarded German positions were built in American yards. Aircraft dominating the skies were produced on American assembly lines. German defenders fought with characteristic tenacity. In some sectors, they inflicted heavy casualties on attackers. But they were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of men and material the Allies brought to bear. When an American infantry company encountered a defended position, they called for artillery support. The artillery fire that followed wasn't a few rounds, but hundreds, sometimes thousands of shells falling in concentrated barrages that pulverized defensive positions. When infantry advanced, tanks supported them. When tanks were stopped, aircraft were called in. Americans had learned to integrate combined arms in ways that multiplied their combat power. German soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front said American warfare style differed from Soviet tactics. The Soviets threw men at problems. Americans threw machines. The outcome was similar, overwhelming force applied relentlessly, but the human cost to Americans was lower. This was deliberate. American doctrine explicitly prioritized firepower over manpower. Why risk soldiers when you could expend ammunition instead? Hitler's misjudgment had consequences rippling through every level of German strategy. Because he believed America would not intervene effectively, he declared war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor, bringing into the conflict an enemy he didn't need to fight. Because he believed American industry couldn't deliver on its promises, he allowed the U-boat campaign to continue long after it had ceased to be strategically viable. Because he believed American soldiers were soft, he failed to reinforce the Western Front adequately until it was too late. The declaration of war on America in December 1941 remains one of the 20th century's most inexplicable strategic decisions. Germany wasn't obligated to declare war under the Tripartite Pact with Japan. That agreement required mutual defense only if one partner was attacked, not if one partner attacked others. Hitler could have remained neutral toward America while Japan fought in the Pacific. His advisors pointed this out. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop reminded Hitler that a declaration of war would add another enemy without corresponding benefit. But Hitler dismissed the concern. He believed war with America was inevitable and that Germany might as well strike first. More importantly, he didn't believe America mattered. A nation of racial mongrels, divided by class and corrupted by Jewish influence, could never possibly affect the war's outcome. This contempt shaped German strategy throughout the conflict. Resources that might have strengthened the U-boat fleet were diverted elsewhere because the American industrial threat wasn't taken seriously. Reinforcements that might have bolstered North African defenses were sent to the Eastern Front because the Mediterranean was considered a secondary theater. Preparations for an Allied invasion were inadequate because the scale of American power wasn't understood. The men who had dismissed American production figures as propaganda watched those figures become reality. The generals who had scorned American fighting quality found themselves retreating before American armies. The strategists who had calculated that Germany could win a war of attrition discovered that attrition favored the side with more to sacrifice. By 1944, Germany was fighting on 3 fronts, with resources barely adequate for one. The Eastern Front consumed most of Germany's military strength. The Mediterranean theater drained divisions that might have defended France. And the bombing campaign, conducted largely by American aircraft, devastated German industry and cities. The 8th Air Force, flying from bases in England, sent formations of B-17 and B-24 bombers over Germany in daylight raids that would have been impossible without American industrial capacity. Early raids suffered terrible losses. German fighters and anti-aircraft guns extracted a heavy toll. But Americans absorbed the losses and kept coming. In October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 heavy bombers and their crews in a single raid on Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories. The losses were proportionally worse than anything the German Air Force had suffered. American commanders debated whether daylight bombing could continue. But American factories replaced the lost aircraft within weeks. Replacement crews arrived from training programs that had expanded to meet the demand. By spring 1944, the 8th Air Force was stronger than it had been before Schweinfurt, and now it had long-range escort fighters, the P-51 Mustang, that could protect bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Hermann Göring, who had dismissed American production claims as fantasy, lived to see his Air Force destroyed by the very industrial might he had mocked. After the war, in a prison interview, he admitted that the tempo of American shipbuilding, particularly Henry Kaiser's program, had surprised and upset German planners. Claims of building ships in 8 to 10 days had seemed fantastic. They weren't fantastic. They were true. By spring 1945, the Thousand-Year Reich was collapsing. American and British forces advanced from the west, while Soviet armies closed in from the east. German cities burned under round-the-clock bombing that the Luftwaffe was powerless to stop. The factories that had produced the Wehrmacht's weapons were rubble. Hitler died in his bunker on April 30, 1945, still convinced his analysis had been correct. If Germany had lost, it was because the German people had failed him, because his generals had betrayed him, because fate had conspired against him. He never accepted that his fundamental assumptions about America had been wrong. The nation he had dismissed as racially inferior and industrially incapable had crushed his armies. The nation he had dismissed as decayed had outproduced Germany by a factor of nearly 3 to 1. The people he had called soft had fought with determination and ferocity across 2 oceans. The industrial capacity he had mocked as propaganda had buried the Wehrmacht under an avalanche of steel and explosives. American industry provided almost 2/3 of all Allied military equipment produced during the war. 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 193,000 artillery pieces, 2 million army trucks. The numbers weren't propaganda. They were reality. The lesson should not be forgotten. German misjudgment of America wasn't simply an intelligence failure. It was a failure of imagination. German leadership looked at America and saw what they expected to see: a soft, divided, undisciplined nation unsuited for war. They didn't see what actually existed: a sleeping giant with industrial capacity, organizational talent, and human determination that would prove unstoppable once awakened. The factories that built Liberty ships and B-24 bombers have mostly been demolished. The workers who staffed them have passed into history. The war they helped win ended 8 decades ago. But the story matters because misjudgment still costs lives. Nations still underestimate their adversaries. Leaders still confuse their assumptions with reality. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes.